folks. Welcome to the first day of class. I would say better late than never. I hope everyone is in a safe place, in as calm a state as possible. I wish everyone good health and um, healing and, again, calm. This is the first lecture, and as such, it is still a work in progress. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my slides. I'm an art historian. I really like using images, so you're not going to be seeing my face a whole lot. I think my plan right as of now is to essentially sort of use the very beginning of each lecture to talk to you directly face to face, to say, hi, how are you, and to give you whatever sort of framing is required for the lecture. And then I'll kind of shift over to just a kind of me narrating the slides that I've prepared for a lecture. So, that being said, today's lecture will be about the British Empire, and specifically about the history of anti-immigrant sentiment in the British Empire, which will prepare us for our two texts for Friday, which are Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. There's a link in the syllabus to I think it's a BBC. At any rate, it's a British sort of public broadcasting special that was done commemorating the 50th anniversary of this speech. And the second text is a film by the Black Audio Film Collective called Handsworth Songs, which is also linked in the syllabus, and it's available on the YouTube channel. All of our lectures will be uploaded to the YouTube channel going forward. I do want to take this opportunity to ask you to please remember to fill out the survey that I sent out. We will be finishing up our midterm presentations in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And I'm just trying to assess sort of how best for you to deliver the work that you've all already done to me within the sort of technological and geographic restraints that we have now been presented with in this new COVID era. So not to fret, you will all be getting full credit for your midterms. I just gotta wait till I hear back from you to figure out sort of where you all are at this particular moment. Another change, which I think is noted on the new syllabus, but I wanted to just reiterate, is that the final exam will now be a take-home, not an in-class. Obviously, we can't have an in-class timed exam anymore, so there will be a take-home exam, which I will upload to Canvas, on probably the final Tuesday of class, and then will be due on the final Friday of class. And it will be open book, open note, open YouTube, open everything. So you can use all of the tools at your disposal to answer the questions that I'm asking you. Great. So without further ado, I don't think I'm forgetting anything else for now. Without further ado, we're just going to get into it. I would ask, actually, when you do email me your responses to my questions on Friday, I would ask that you also let me know how this form of sort of absorbing information is working for you. I'm not sure that just a narrated slide presentation is the most engaging thing in the world, but considering my own technological limitations at the moment, it was the best way to try to get something up on the website for today. If it's not working for you, I'm going to try to get a little bit fancier, see if I can do like a split screen situation. I'm going to try to be as interactive as possible, because part of what I really feed off of is being there in class with you and seeing your faces and getting a sense if there's something that I say that you don't understand. And so without that kind of feedback, I think even for me, lecturing is a struggle, and I would imagine that it would also be a struggle for you listening. So do let me know sort of give me some feedback on what would make these videos more easy for you to absorb. All right, so lecture 1, let's go. We talked about this a little bit at the end of the period right before spring break, but I'm just trying to refresh our memories. We're talking about the British Empire, and at its peak in the late 19 teens, at the end of World War I, it is the largest empire in the world, and it's the largest empire in history. At this particular moment, it comprises about 25% of the world's land mass, as you can see illustrated on this map in red, and also about 25% of the world's entire population. So if you can imagine, in 1919, 25% of the people on the face of the planet were subjects of the British Empire. Despite a more than 4 centuries long track record of traveling around the world and attempting to sort of transform various cultures of the world into their own image, the British also curiously have a pretty long-standing tradition of xenophobia and protectionism. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit today in preparation for our readings for Friday. And, in thinking about the history of xenophobia and protectionism in the United Kingdom, I thought a really good place to start is a little bit more contemporary, a little bit closer to our own times, Brexit, right? I think this is something you've probably heard about in the news and may not know specifics on, and so I thought, this would be a good place to start to talk about this history. For those of you who don't know, xenophobia is a word that literally just means fear of the other, right? Typically, it's a word that's used to describe fear of immigrants, fear of people who are ethnic minorities, or who are from other parts of the world. And so Brexit is a very contemporary example of the UK's long-standing fear of outsiders. Brexit is a sort of shortened version, a cute way of referring to Britain's exit from the EU, from the European Union. And this was a process that began after a popular vote ushered it in the summer of 2016. So it's been about 4 years since Great Britain has been undergoing this process of trying to detangle itself from the European Union. For those of you who don't know what the European Union is or was, it was first introduced in the 1990s, so before most of you were born. But the idea behind it was that it was supposed to be a Western European free trade zone designed to increase Western Europe's competitive advantage in the global economy, on the global stage, in the global marketplace. Along with that, it introduced the idea of a shared currency. So the euro, which is used throughout most of Europe, was introduced in the 90s as part of the European Union. Before that, there were things like the franc and the lira and all these different currencies in these different European countries. And also, along with the foundation of the EU, there also came sort of additional privileges of migration between different member states of this new union. So those in Great Britain who are opposed to the European Union are also known as Eurosceptics. And it's largely, Eurosceptics in the UK have largely been sort of right-wing conservatives. And even sort of before Brexit, back in the 90s, back when the EU was first being founded, Eurosceptics successfully prevented the UK from adopting the euro as its currency. So the UK still uses the pound, the British pound, and actually the UK is the only nation in the EU that doesn't use the euro. And this is because of the Eurosceptics. This is because of their fear of involvement with, even with Western Europe, right? But currently, the problem with the EU that the Eurosceptics have is primarily, surprise, surprise, about immigration, about sort of wanting Britain to have its own sort of independent and strict immigration policy without having to adhere to the more sort of open door like policies of places like Germany in particular. So currently, the UK gets about 500 people added to its population every day. Again, this is a country that at one point colonized 25% of the world. And over the last sort of 50 years, the chickens of that colonial legacy have come home to roost in the form of reverse migration. The city of London in particular has been over 50% immigrant for several years, meaning that only about 40 to 45% of London's population is actually white British people. The rest are people from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Nigeria and Ghana and Jamaica and, Palestine and all of these former British colonies, as well as some migrants from other parts of Europe and the United States. So again, Eurosceptics want to curtail this process. They want Britain to be able to sort of be free to enforce its own strict immigration policies. But this process of people coming from all over to the UK doesn't start with Britain joining the EU, which was again in the 1990s. The process, as I mentioned before, of migrants coming to the UK starts as early as World War II. And so I want us to talk a little bit about that history because it really, I think, will inform our understanding of the cultural makeup of London right now in recent years, and also will give context for some of the texts that we're going to be looking at in the next couple of weeks. So following World War II, which by the way was a war in which soldiers born in the colonies fought and died in quite large numbers, in fact, on behalf of the UK. Following World War II, it was determined that anyone born in a colony of the United Kingdom, with a few limited exceptions, was entitled to a special status known as, quote, citizenship of the United Kingdom and its colonies. So among other things, this status gave individuals the right to live and work in the United Kingdom, and so it set off a wave of migration that lasted from about the late 1940s until the 1960s, which was a decade during which most of England's colonial holdings, particularly those in Africa, gained their independence. This image that you see here in the bottom left corner is a still frame from a film called Nine Muses by a Black British filmmaker named John Akomfrah, who we'll be talking about in a little bit, depicting sort of a group of migrants, I believe in this case from the West Indies, the Caribbean, the British Caribbean, coming over by boat to the UK in the 1940s. And the image on the top right is just sort of, to sort of show you that influx of people during the middle part of the 20th century. Now, as in the United States, when Black and brown people move into neighborhoods, white families tend to move out. This is something that was happening, in fact, around the same time here in the U.S. In the 50s and 60s. For the first time, you had African Americans able to buy homes or rent apartments in what had formerly been white middle class areas. The 50s and 60s they become the era of white flight in the United States as white property owners fear the influx of people of color in their neighborhoods, Black African Americans in particular. There's a similar process that happens in the UK. As these waves of immigrants come from India and Bangladesh and Nigeria and elsewhere, they settle in neighborhoods that were formerly occupied by white Brits, particularly in London. Um, and then, London and England more broadly undergoes this process of white flight. Um, and this is a process that still persists, and you can see the legacy of this process in the geography of London, in contemporary England, in contemporary London. So the image that we have here at the center of the screen is a census map from 2011 of London. And it shows sort of the concentration of different ethnic groups sorted by color on the map of London. And what I really want to point out is that, the areas where white Londoners live overlap very little with the areas where Londoners of color live. I should also point out that if we look at the map of Black and Asian Londoners, and those are sort of the two largest groups, right, is either Black Africans or Afro-Caribbeans on the one hand, and then South Asian immigrants on the other hand. There is some overlap, so there are these areas where you now have people from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh interacting with people from Jamaica and Ghana and Nigeria, but then there are also areas of segregation. And so, as London becomes this cosmopolitan city, it also becomes a kind of fractured city. It becomes a city where everyone is sort of in their pocket. And where different groups of people are interacting at the margins of these neighborhoods, it tends to be, historically at least, Black and brown people from different parts of the empire interacting with each other. And that's one of the things that, we're going to talk about in a little bit, is the sort of cultural consequences of both of the segregation and of these places of interaction and overlap. All of these people, again, 50% currently of Londoners are either foreign-born themselves or are the children or grandchildren of people who were born not in the United Kingdom. And so these are people who are in London, but still they're not really considered British. Unlike the United States, which I think, has a particular mode of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is one of the themes of this class. And I think in the United States, despite our own very real problems with xenophobia, particularly at present, our nation likes to think of itself as an open country, right? As a country where at least in theory there is a pathway to truly becoming American for all through this sort of idealized notion of a melting pot or the American dream. Like, we have all of these metaphors and all of these sort of stories that we tell ourselves about how to become American, right? And that it's something that can be achieved by anyone. The Statue of Liberty is a sort of symbol of our openness as a nation, which, I think in some ways is also tied to our sort of youngness as a nation, right? The fact that we think of ourselves as new, despite the fact that there have been people on this continent for, thousands of years. We think of ourselves as this kind of experiment, as this multicultural experiment, a modern experiment. Britain, on the other hand, is an ancient society. It's one of the oldest democracies in the world. It thinks of itself as ancient. And it's also a society within which this idea that heredity is destiny is very strong. In Britain they have still to this day a really persistent belief in like social class and the idea of a noble class, which again is tied to the idea that like heredity is destiny. And so I think particularly for that reason, sort of no matter how long your family has been in the UK, if they migrated from someplace else, particularly someplace else outside of Europe, you're not ever going to be truly British, right? What makes you British is having this long line of British ancestors that goes back to William the Conqueror or, Queen Elizabeth I or whatever sort of long distant British ancestors that, the English like to associate themselves with. And so we've got, more than half of a city that, in the eyes of this state and in the eyes of sort of the dominant culture are not seen as legitimately British. And that brings me that idea of, these large groups of people coming to England after in many cases having sort of helped to build the financial and military security of this country and prosperity of this country, being rejected, it brings us to our first text for today, which is, or the text we'll be reading for Friday, or listening to for Friday rather, which is a very famous, maybe even infamous speech by a British parliamentarian named Enoch Powell, called the Rivers of Blood speech, which was delivered in a closed session, but later made public. It was delivered in 1968, and we'll talk on Friday a bit more about sort of what the consequences of, or the significance of 1968 was in England and the United States at that particular moment. And this is really a turning point. The Rivers of Blood speech and the sentiment behind it become a real turning point for Britain, and particularly for the history of anti-immigrant sentiment in Britain. So a little bit about Enoch Powell, who you're going to be hearing a lot from between now and Friday. He was a member of the British Parliament. They call them MPs for short, members of Parliament. He was a member of the House of Commons. So the British Parliament is divided into two bodies, much like the United States Congress. They have a House of Commons and a House of Lords. I'm not going to go that much into the House of Lords, but essentially, again, going back to this idea that heredity is destiny, the House of Lords is comprised of essentially British nobility. They're inherited titles. They're not elected positions. The House of Commons, on the other hand, is an elected system, much like our own Congress. So Enoch Powell was a conservative member of British Parliament in the House of Commons from 1950 to 1987. So he's there right for the beginning of the rise of immigration, and he is then in power sort of through that first generation of second generation immigrants being born in London, in England. He's best known for his conservative anti-immigrant fervor, and in particular for the Rivers of Blood speech, which he delivered in a closed conservative political meeting in 1968 on the eve of sweeping civil rights legislation that was being proposed by the British Labour Party, which is the sort of the left-leaning party. The speech, which was also made public, was so controversial in its contents that he was initially fired from Parliament following what came to be known as the Rivers of Blood speech, because of a particular line that he uses in the speech. But he was actually eventually reinstated after massive protests from the right-wing working classes really showed the Conservative Party how much support Powell's ideas had at the time. It should be noted that this speech was delivered in 1968, which is the year of the sort of infamous Democratic Convention in the United States. It's the year that Nixon is elected. It is the year of Bobby Kennedy's assassination. It is the year of Martin Luther King's assassination. It is a watershed moment in global history, where in many parts of the West there is a shift from what had been a sort of progressive period into a period of relative conservatism. And there's also, particularly in the United States and in the UK, that shift is marked by a great deal of racial animosity and interracial violence. So, you're gonna listen to the speech. It was recently, I don't know if you would call it a celebration, but we recently passed the 50th anniversary of the speech. The BBC did a whole sort of special, a retrospective on it, particularly in light of Brexit, right? The 50th anniversary of Rivers of Blood happens sort of right in the middle of Brexit, which, by the way, has not yet been resolved. The UK is kind of in limbo about whether or not they are going to actually be leaving the European Union. But considering that it's largely being driven, their potential exit from the EU is being driven by a sort of fear of others, fear of immigrants. It felt like a good time to revisit Powell and to explore this speech, which really was a sort of iconic moment in British political history. So I'll be interested to see sort of how you feel about that speech and sort of what your impressions of it are. On the right of this screen, we have a woman who you're more likely to have heard of. Enoch Powell is very famous in the UK. I don't think a lot of Americans know about him. I would be surprised if any of you had learned about him in school. He was very influential in British politics for many years. But again, he's not necessarily an international figure. The woman on the right is an international figure. You may recognize her even though she's before your time. A woman named Margaret Thatcher. So Margaret Thatcher was the first, she's most notable, perhaps, for being the first female prime minister of Great Britain, and also one of the first female prime ministers or premiers, presidents in the history of sort of the modern world. She served as a prime minister of Great Britain from 1979 to 1990. So basically the 80s. The period of the 1980s was the sort of Thatcher period in British history. It also aligned very closely with the Reagan era here in the United States. So, Ronald Reagan, I believe, was president from 1980 until 1988. So there's a period in basically for the entirety of the 1980s where both in the UK and in the United States there are these sort of very charismatic, very well loved and popular, but very conservative heads of state who are sort of acting in concert with each other to really sort of affect the face of global politics. But at any rate, So Margaret Thatcher is interesting. She's going to come up in the other text that we see that we're going to be looking at for Friday, which is Jana Kamfra's Hansworth songs. And she's also, I think, going to be looming in the background of Zadie Smith's White Teeth when we get to read it, which is going to start after class on Friday. If we're going to talk about sort of what it meant to make art as an immigrant, or what it even meant to live, not even just thinking about the arts, but what it meant to live as an immigrant in the UK in the 70s, 80s, 90s. You can't really think about that without thinking of Margaret Thatcher. Her policies really shaped sort of modern immigrant experience in the United Kingdom. And even though she is not generally thought of as a firebrand or a bigot in the same way that Powell is usually seen, she was very much a student of his. He was an advisor to her. Throughout, much of her career. Again, he was a conservative leader in Parliament through 1987. So for the first 8 of her 11 years of service as Prime Minister, he was sort of right there in government also, sort of pushing his agenda, and to a certain extent had her ear. So Margaret Thatcher, her rhetoric, and she was known as being an anti-immigrant force, is in some ways a kinder, gentler version of the kind of thing that we're going to hear from Enoch Powell. So we're just going to play for you briefly an interview that Margaret Thatcher gave in 1978, shortly before becoming elected as the new Prime Minister of Great Britain. I should say that the way that the UK system works is that the party gets elected, not the person. The party gets elected, and then each party chooses its leaders. And the same thing goes also for Parliament. So you vote for, a party, and then the party determines its actual governors, essentially. But at any rate, she is the sort of proposed Prime Minister for the Conservative Party, and she's being interviewed here about her particular viewpoint, her plans for immigration policy were the Conservative Party to come into power at this particular moment. And so let's just listen. It's a quick clip.
Now that's an awful lot. And I think it means that people are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world, that if there's any fear that it might be swamped, people are going to react and be rather hostile to those coming in. So if you want good race relations, you've got to allay people's fears on numbers. It isn't as if we've great wide open spaces or great natural resources. We haven't. So either you go on taking in 40 or 50,000 a year, which is far too many, or you say we must hold out the prospect of a clear end to immigration. And that is the view we've taken. And I'm certain that is the right view to keep good race relations and to keep fundamental British characteristics which have done so much for the world.
But you will then have a tough new immigration policy should you come to power.
I have described what it is. How you describe what I say is a matter for you.
And it will be a major election issue as far as the
I
Conservatives.
shall not make it a major election issue, but I think there's a feeling that the big political parties haven't been talking about this. And sometimes, we are falsely accused of racial prejudice. I say falsely accused. And that means that we don't talk about it perhaps as much as we should. In my view, That's one thing that's driving some people to the National Front. They don't agree with the objectives of the National Front, but they say that at least they're talking about some of the problems.
So, for those of you who are curious, the National Front actually was a far right, sort of borderline neo Nazi organization that had become popular in the UK in the late 1970s, early 80s. And we'll talk a little bit more after we've listened to Anil Pal's speech about sort of how his ideas get boiled down into Thatcher's rhetoric, um, and not even just his ideas, but also his sort of approach to making arguments. So just keep that in mind, revisit that as we move forward. So the other piece that we're going to be watching or listening to for Friday is a film called Handsworth Songs that was written and directed by Jana Kamfra under the auspices of the Black Audio Film Collective. And I want us to, with this piece, be really thinking about the other side of immigrant life in London in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So we've got the sort of xenophobic, anti-immigrant view that the government took towards these people. But then we've also got the reality of there's millions of people here who are living and creating new identities for themselves, and creating really incredible art. And so what does that art have to say about this experience? One of the consequences of African and Caribbean and South Asian and Arab migrants from the farthest corners of the empire converging on the UK during the mid to late 20th century was that by the 1980s you had this second wave, the second generation of British born, or at least British identified young folks who were growing up alongside each other, sharing their respective traditions and creating new collective identities. So if we, were to go back to this earlier map that I showed you, we've got pockets of Pakistanis, pockets of Bangladeshis, pockets of Jamaicans or Nigerians or Ghanaians, but we've also got pockets of overlap. And so we have children from all these different backgrounds, also interacting with the dominant British culture, and creating this kind of chutney, this kind of new world identity, in a very old world place, England. And creating a culture that's really beautiful and really complicated. I would, go so far as to say that's particularly true in the arts, and that as a result of this mixing, some of the most important artists and thinkers of the late 20th century actually emerged. Some of the most important artists and thinkers of the late 20th century come out of London between, the 1970s and the 1990s. So, for example, we have here Steve McQueen, who some of you may be familiar with, some of you filmmakers in particular. He's a, very well-respected and well-known British filmmaker. He's probably best known to you as the director of 12 Years a Slave, for which he won a Best Picture Academy Award, I believe in 2014 or 2015. But he was born in London in 1969 of a Grenadian father and a Trinidadian mother. He was raised in this sort of multi-ethnic environment and, attended these sort of multi-ethnic schools. And that informs his work, that informs the way that he works. We also have people like Chris O'Feely, who you may or may not be familiar with. He is a Nigerian British artist, born 1968. So again, we've got Steve McQueen, born in 69. We've got Chris O'Feely, born in 68. So right around the sort of, late 60s, the late 50s through the early 70s, you have this generation of people who are coming up, who are born in the UK or who come to the UK at a very, very young age, And they're grappling with this new identity, what it means to be British when what most people understand to be Britishness is whiteness, what it means to be Black British, what it means to be Indian British, in a society where belonging is not offered, right? So at any rate, another example of artists, thinkers coming out of this time is Chris Ofili. He was born in London in 1968 of Nigerian parents. He is a painter. He's still sort of one of the, I would say, better known painters in the world at this point. He's a very, widely collected and exhibited artist now, sort of in his full sort of maturity. In the 1980s and 90s, he was a young emerging artist. He sort of rose to international prominence in the late 90s because of his painting Holy Virgin Mary, which is pictured here on the left. It was painted with gold leaf and adorned with, among other things, elephant dung and photographic clippings from pornography. And it caused one of the most significant scandals in the art world of the 20th century when it debuted as part of a traveling exhibition called Sensation. When the painting came to New York in particular in 1999, it caused a pretty significant stir. It had been already on display in London and Berlin at that point, but when it came to New York, then Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who you may recognize from our current political situation, actually brought a court case against the against the Brooklyn Museum, which is where this Sensation show was on display, describing the exhibition as sick and disgusting, and describing Ofili's work in particular as desecration. He even called it Catholic bashing. Giuliani himself is a Roman Catholic, and Giuliani attempted to cut public funding for the museum and threatened to evict the museum from its building in retaliation against them putting this image on display. In response, actually, the museum filed a lawsuit against Giuliani for breach of the First Amendment, and the museum won out in court, and there were no real consequences for having had this piece on display. But this was a real cultural moment in the late 1990s. I'm sure many of you wouldn't remember it because you were not alive. I was alive. But it was a moment in sort of the global art world, and even that reached beyond the global art world. I was a child at the time, and I remember being aware, even as like a fifth grader, that there was a scandal happening, and that art had something to do with free speech, and that art had something to do with public funding, and that art has something to do with religion, that contemporary art has something to do with religion. And it's not often that a work of fine art really kind of reaches the masses. So, I mean, this is a slight aside, but this is all to say that, this particular artist, who really, I think, was one of the more challenging artists of the latter part of the 20th century for a lot of people, also comes out of this multi-ethnic London context that we're going to be studying for the next few weeks. And I should say in that vein that this is not a painting that he created necessarily to be exclusively provocative, right? He himself, a Christian, himself actually a Catholic, at least in terms of how he was raised, is not trying to desecrate the Madonna, right? He's not trying to desecrate the Virgin Mary. In fact, he's really trying to complicate Christian notions of what is sacred, traditional Christian notions of what is sacred and what is profane, by using materials, iconography, associated with fertility, fecundity, growth, and also associated with more West African modes of worship to illustrate a traditionally Christian icon. Right? So it's intentionally provocative, but it's not intentionally a desecration. He's fusing his various identities, which include being Nigerian British, being Catholic, being an immigrant, working in the tradition of painting, which is a very sort of, painting on canvas is a very Western tradition. And so he's thinking through all of these issues of like, how do I belong in this system that wasn't designed for me? This system being fine art in the West, right? Being painting, easel painting. This system being Christianity. This system being Britain, being London, being traditional arts educational institutions. All of these things he's coming up against, and he's having to sort of negotiate his way and figure out a way to fit into these spaces and to create an identity for himself that makes sense. So, in a way, this image is sort of a representation of that process of not so much assimilation, but acculturation, creating new identities in new settings. And another, just one last aside, which I always find interesting, this painting was recently purchased and then donated to the Museum of Modern Art by a very rich, I think probably billionaire, named Stephen A. Cohen, who is one of Trump's largest financial backers. And I find that ironic because at the time that the Sensation show was at the Brooklyn Museum in 1999, Trump was right there with Rudy Giuliani, encouraging, the city to withdraw funding from the museum, calling it a desecration, calling it disgusting. So there's this kind of full circle moment where, what was once seen as a desecration and as deeply offensive has now become the sort of status symbol that even sort of conservative donors, embrace, essentially. Another really important figure who comes out of this environment is a man named Paul Gilroy, who we're not reading, and I'm not going to bore you by talking about him at length, but he is his Guyanese. He is born of one Guyanese parent and one British parent in London in the 1950s, late 50s, 56 to be exact. He's part of the same generation. He's best known for his 1993 book, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness. And this is a really important work because it is really one of the first works that frames Black identity as modern Black identity as diasporic, as fundamentally diasporic, meaning that it is fundamentally formed in relationship to Black people all over the world, right? That it's not about, that African American history and Black British history and African history and Caribbean history are not properly separate histories. That you can't really understand Black British history without understanding African American history. That you can't really understand African American history without understanding Afro-Caribbean history. That you can't understand African history without understanding African American history. This is very broadly and very simplistically part of his thesis in this book. And, before the 90s, that was not really the way that people thought about Blackness as a fundamentally diasporic global phenomenon. And so, organizations like the ADC here at UR, it's, the Afro-Diasporic Collective, would not have been called that prior to Gilroy. So again, all these really important ideas are coming to the fore because of because of this multicultural London pot that's simmering with all these really diverse ingredients. We already talked about also polystyrene, who's another example of, born in 57, so a year after Gilroy. Again, she's the daughter of a Somali migrant to England, Somalia being formerly of the British Empire. And she is, in her capacity as a mixed race artist, really grappling with what it means to identify as black and white, as neither black nor white, as a woman, as an artist, as a British person. And so you have, in this multicultural context, you have, these young artists of color who are really exploring identity, exploring not only their own individual identities, but the actual sort of structure of identity itself, the function of identity itself, the mechanisms of identity itself, and are also sort of pushing the boundaries of what it means to identify. And I think there is no better example of that than the Black Audio Film Collective, which was a sort of coalition, a collective of experimental filmmakers of color active in London during the 1980s and 90s. With films including Handsworth Songs, which we're going to be watching for Friday, they sought to challenge dominant British representations of people of color, and also to challenge dominant historical narratives about empire and power. They define their primary audience as diasporic peoples. So again, they're working right around the same time as Gilroy, and they're thinking about their audience not as African or Caribbean or even Black British, but as diasporic subjects, as diasporic people. I also think it's worth noting that several of the members, including co-founder Lena Gopal, who's pictured here, were not properly Black per se, right? So Lena Gopal is South Asian by extraction. Several other sort of affiliated members of the Black Audio Film Collective were also South Asian. But in the Black Audio Film Collective, blackness, and I'm making air quotes, came to be more about being an outsider to the British mainstream than about actual sort of African ancestry per se. So this is a collective that's primarily made of sort of Afro-diasporic, the children of Afro-diasporic immigrants, but it's more capacious, it's more broad than that in terms of its membership, and everyone, just sort of irrespective of their actual sort of racial makeup, is sort of using blackness, working under the mantle of blackness to talk about what it means to be an outsider in Britain in the 1980s and 90s. So we're going to be watching for Friday their most well-known film, a film called Handsworth Songs, but I did want to briefly talk about one of their first films. In fact, I think this was their first film as a collective, called Signs of Empire, which was produced in 1983 while most of the collective members were still undergraduates studying a range of subjects from fine art to sociology to psychology at a college called Portsmouth Polytechnic, which is in the south coast of England. Signs of Empire was sort of part one of a two-part 35mm slide tape text entitled Expeditions. And this film, and we'll talk a little bit, I'm also using air quotes to sort of describe this as a film, and I'll talk about why in a second, but this film toured art schools, art centers, and art galleries throughout England during the winter of 1984 and 1985. So the reason I put air quotes around the word film when describing this piece is that it was actually more like a, uh, a narrated or um, a, a, um, a slideshow essentially with narration with an audio track associated with it. It was sort of basically uh, two separate slide projectors um, that were sort of seamed together using a technology at the time known as a Kodak dissolve unit. And so it essentially allowed a kind of fade effect in and out from one projector to the other and back and forth. And so it was just really a sequence of still images that were faded in and out of each other from two separate slide projectors. And again, this is the 80s, so we're not talking about like a digital slide projector. We're talking about sort of, you know, actual slides, physical slides. And then there was a soundtrack that was, and actually, the images in the slides had been overlaid with pieces of text. As you can see, these are two stills from Signs of Empire. So, here on the left, there's a sort of image of somewhere in South Asia, probably India, but maybe Pakistan or Bengal or Bangladesh. You have a few British colonial figures sitting here, being fanned by their attendants. Here on the right, you have an illustration of a colonial school, I believe, in Australia, where Aboriginal children are being sort of instructed in, I don't know whether it's English or Christianity, various forms of sort of Western education. And then these underlying images are overlaid with text. You see the sad on the left and symbolic of on the right. And this is sort of how they would generally structure their slides, is they would have text kind of trailing off the side and then sort of fade in and out of these images. And then while that was happening, there was an accompanying soundtrack that combined music with and political speeches in a kind of taped loop. So I'm going to play just a really quick clip to give you a sense of what that's like. This is just like a 1 minute clip from the very beginning of Signs of Empire. So again, you've got these still images, and it's just a kind of crossfade effect, right? That's all it is. It's slide in, slide out, slide in, slide out, and also most of the images used in Signs of Empire and a lot of the Black Audio Film Collective's early work were found images, right? So these are not photographs that they took themselves. These are sort of found images that they have cropped or otherwise altered and then transformed further by laying text on top of them. Great, okay. So, I am throwing up this image of Osco because in many ways the Black Audio Film Collective and Osco remind me of each other. They are sort of contemporaries in a sense, even though Osco is, getting started maybe 10 years earlier. They're both collectives that are very much interested, they're collectives of color. They are very much interested in social and political commentary, and social and political commentary from the margins, right? They're part of what they're expressing is their own marginality within a multicultural society. And they're expressing that marginality using a kind of DIY lo-fi um, ethos or set of techniques. And specifically, even more, they're interested in film, right? So they're sort of using DIY, a DIY lo-fi approach to kind of hack into the filmmaking industry, which is an extremely expensive industry, right? None of these people have money to actually make a film properly. So, like, what do if you are, one of the members of Black Audio Film Collective? You appropriate images, you cut out text, you overlay image and text, you create a soundtrack, you seam it all together, right? If you're Osco, you create these no movies, right? You do this kind of you create costumes, you create a scene, and I mean that both sort of in terms of the dramaticness of their no movies, and also in the sense that these are only a single scene that's being captured in these images, and that's all they could afford, is to just to capture this one image. But I also think that these two collectives have a shared interest in the possibility of creating together as an act of collective consciousness. I'm going to say that again. So they're interested in the possibility of creating together as an act of collective consciousness. This is another kind of identity exploration, creation that we haven't really thought about before. We've thought about identity as a kind of individual experience. We've thought about identity as a way of sort of understanding what bucket we fall into as humans, right? I am African American, I am a woman, I am this, I am that, I belong to these various larger categories. But one thing that these collectives have allowed artists to do is to explore this kind of other dynamic, or this other possibility of identity, as something that is collective, but that is sort of created collectively, right? It's not something that we opt in or out of. It's something that we actually shape in relationship to other people, in conversation with other people. And so it kind of becomes a microcosm of larger processes of how group identities form. At any rate, the second text for Friday is Handsworth Songs, which is probably the Black Audiophone Collective's best known project. It was produced in 1986, written and directed by John Akomfra, who was actually born in Ghana but moved to the United Kingdom at a very young age. It was produced by Lena Gopal, who again is one of the founding members of Black Audio Film Collective, and it took as its subject matter a series of riots that happened in 1985 in the Handsworth area of Birmingham, which is a mid-sized city in England, and also around the same time riots had happened in London. And in both of these cases, these riots were sparked by the over-policing of black and brown youth in primarily black and brown neighborhoods. And so this film, Handsworth Songs, sets out to create a much more complex narrative around this riot than what was available, or around these riots, plural, than what was available in the mainstream media in Britain at this time. It was commissioned by Channel 4 for part of a series called Britain, The Lie of the Land. And for this commission, the Black Audio Film Collective really used their now renowned method of intermixing newsreel, still photos, sound mosaics, and other audiovisual text to create a multi-layered, oftentimes non-linear kind of narrative, voice, series of voices. And so that's what we're going to be watching for Friday. There, as promised, are a few questions that I want you to answer. Again, choose only one. You don't have to answer all three. Choose one of these questions and please email me your response by noon on Friday. So there's one question about the rivers of blood speech, and there's two possible questions that are somewhat related um, about Hansworth songs. I will explain them a little bit now. So question number one, Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech was written to be a persuasive piece of rhetoric. It was oratory. It was presented to sort of make an argument about really curtailing immigration to the UK at that time in 1968. The question I want you to answer is, what kinds of evidence Powell used to structure or support his anti-immigrant argument? I want you to reflect on what he actually, not just on his argument, but on how he structures it and what evidence he uses to structure his argument. And then why do you think he chooses to support his argument in the way that he does? Right? You can use all different kinds of strategies when you're trying to convince or persuade somebody. For example, you can use guilt, you can use hope, you can use statistics, you can use sort of emotional pleas, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can try to persuade somebody. And so I want you to listen to the speech and then think about what he's doing. Is he using statistics? Is he using fear? Is he using, logic? Is he using, studies? Is he, what is he, I want you to get specific, right? Like, what is he using? How does he structure his argument? What kinds of evidence specifically is he using? And why? So that's the question. What kind of evidence is he using and why? Okay, question number 2 and 3 are both about Hansworth songs. And they both come from the fact that Hansworth song is about the London and Hansworth riots, but it approaches its subject indirectly. And by that I mean that the film doesn't actually contain very much riot footage, and it also is missing the kind of omniscient narrator telling us what happened and how to interpret it that we've come to expect from most documentaries. And so the two questions I have about Hansworth songs ask you to reflect on that, on the fact that this is sort of not a traditional documentary that sort of takes a circuitous approach to its subject matter. So question number 2 is, what other kinds of still or moving images does Akomfor use to construct his film about British immigrant life in the late 20th century? What do you think is the intended effect of the non-riot images? Give at least one specific example. So I'm asking, literally watching the film, take a little notepad and write down, what kinds of images are you seeing? If you're not seeing images of the riot, what are you seeing images of? And why do you think those images were chosen? Okay, so that's question number 2. Question number 3, who narrates this film? I've already given you a hint, a spoiler alert. This is not your typical omniscient, God in the sky, Morgan Freeman overdubbed narrator. So if it's not that, who does narrate this film? And how would you describe the style of narration? Why do you think Akomfor chose to have his film narrated in this way? And I want you, again, to give me one specific example of who we hear from, right? Who's narrating? And why do you think that person was chosen? If you have any questions about these questions or anything else, please email me. All of this is leading up to We're going to be spending several days reading uh, some excerpts from Zadie Smith's White Teeth, which I'm really excited about. And I really think that the more that we can dig into these questions, the more that we can dig into this material, the better prepared we'll be to really tackle that text. So, with that said, thank you for tuning in. I will see you again on the internets on Friday. All the best.